The Reconquista Initiative presents Feminism is entirely dependent on men. In these politically correct times, where women are, from time to time, privileged and promoted at the expense of men, one of the most fascinating truths that is still subconsciously understood by most people, yet spoken of by nearly no one, is the fact that women, in essence, are entirely dependent on men, and they very likely always will be. Indeed, it is perhaps the greatest irony of the entire feminist movement that, in principle, that very movement, which is allegedly meant to empower women and make them equal to men, is, at the most fundamental level, a movement that is totally at the mercy of the very patriarchy that feminism despises. And to make the irony even greater, a solid case can be made that the female dependence on men can never, in principle, be erased. And so, all the women in Western society demanding equality, protesting about sexism, and screaming about the patriarchy are only able to do so because of the very patriarchy that they rail against. And the fact that they do not realize that this is the case simply goes to show how utterly blind and/or obtuse they are to this fundamental fact. Now, having alleged that women, even today, are utterly dependent on men, let me explain what I mean. First, note the obvious fact that men are naturally, and thus on average, stronger, more aggressive, and more capable of serious violence than women. Unless you disagree, note that prisons are filled with a hell of a lot more men than women, and also that, for example, an average male UFC fighter could easily beat even the very best female fighter. So the fact that men are more physically capable in the realm of violence and war is not really in dispute. So that is the first point to note. But also note, as a second point, that while we in the West talk quaintly about human rights, the fact is that while might does not make right, might does, in fact, make the rules. And indeed, human, quote, rights only remain rights because men with guns stand ready with might to enforce those rights. But without those men, it would take no more than a moment for those rights to be suppressed by whoever had the might to do so. And so again, the reality is that, ultimately, in this life, might does indeed make the rules. And so all this brings us back to the key point of this article, which is that since, on average, men have substantially more might than women do, it is thus men who have made the rules in the past, and they could do so again if desired. Thus, the freedom and rights and so-called equality that women in the West enjoy today only exist because Western men, who are not equal to women in might but superior to them in this respect, have permitted Western women to have these things. So without the permission of men, whether that permission is granted tacitly or overtly, women would, in practice, have none of the freedoms and rights that they currently enjoy. Now, even in today's modern society, where the disparity in might between the sexes has somewhat diminished due to the advent of technological equalizers, the fact is that men, for good and obvious reasons, still make up the majority of the so-called might professions, such as the police and the military. And so, for example, when some strapping 250-pound man starts beating his wife, the only thing, in the end, that will stop him is either another man or a woman with a weapon most likely invented by a man. So again, women, in this respect, are dependent on men. And indeed, just to make the matter even more acute and ironic for today's feminists, note that, as mentioned in the last example, even when women can defend themselves today via technology, the fact is that the very technologies that women today use to give themselves physical parity with men were nevertheless still largely invented by men, meaning that even in this respect, women are still dependent on men and still have a debt to pay to them. So even the technology that women can use to escape the need for men still show their ultimate and historical need and dependence on men. However, in contradistinction to the main thrust of this essay, a woman might object that a man is utterly dependent on a woman in the sense that only a woman can give birth to a man and give him life. And in this respect, women are correct. But even here, the value of women is dependent on the kindness of men. For make no mistake, if men, as a collective, wish to do so, and obviously no one is condoning this, but the point is to make clear that it could, in theory, be done, men could enslave all women in such a manner that they could do nothing but give birth at the whim of men. Indeed, a society where reproduction was achieved through total female subjugation would be an absolutely abhorrent one, but the fact is that such a society could survive and even thrive to some degree, as it does in Afghanistan, for example. And so this is precisely the point. Might makes the rules, and so the only reason that such an absolute female oppressing society has not been created, although certain areas in the Muslim world, as mentioned, come relatively close to doing so, is because men do not allow it, not because women could stop it. And so, the long and short of it is this. At present, the only reason that women enjoy any rights is because, ultimately, men, in one way or another, have allowed women to enjoy those rights. And this truism is not bound to change anytime soon. And while certain men allow women to have these rights because doing so grants the men greater might and power in other areas, the fact remains that, in the end, and at a fundamental level, the gains of Western feminism exist and only continue to exist because Western men have granted permission, whether tacitly or otherwise, for those gains to exist. For indeed, if all men, collectively, decided to completely change their minds about feminism tomorrow and remove all the rights from women on a whim, there is, in fact, little that women could do to stop them. And women should not forget these facts, nor should they forget that their existence in the West is arguably the best that they could ask for, and that to push men too far may lead to a backlash that they might rather not wish to experience. Now, as always, please subscribe to this channel and support it either through PayPal at reconquistainitiative.com or through Patreon at patreon.com/reconquistainitiative. Thank you.